Good afternoon. Welcome to the third and final day of the OECD's Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. This year, we are focusing on the theme of securing natural capital, resilience, risk management, and COVID-19. So this afternoon, we will start off with a session dedicated to the question of measurement, entitled Measuring Natural Capital and Biodiversity. I would like to invite our esteemed chair for this session, Ms. Viveka Palm. Viveka is the chair of the OECD Working Party on Environmental Information, and she's also the deputy head of regions and environment at the Statistics Sweden. And with that, I would like to kick off the session by handing over the floor to Viveka. So over to you, Viveka.
Thank you very much. So hello, everyone, and welcome to session 4, Measuring Natural Capital and Biodiversity. We will focus today on how to measure biodiversity in ways that can inform policy and follow up, and ideally also to help learning, so that we would want to have measurements that can grasp all the expert knowledge that we have around biodiversity, but also make it into a form where it can also teach the rest of us who are not experts in particular issues, and to get this overview where it's possible to understand how to go about to actually make the situation better than it is today. We have 3 policy questions that will be addressed in this session. The first one is what main challenges do we have in order to measure natural capital or ecosystem assets and services, and how can we make that better than what we have it right now? The second question is, how do we further harmonize these measurements and make it easier to make international comparable data so that it can be used, for example, in CBD? And the third one is how to showcase why do we want to have data? What's the good thing for every country to actually help out and make sure that these statistics or these data are there and are available for the people who need to see them in order to make sustainable development come closer to us. So for this session, we have 2 scene setters. It is Professor Paul Ekins, and it's Carl Obst, who is working on the various standards in the system for environmental and ecosystem accounts. So we will hear them talk about where we stand, and afterwards we will also hear the reflections from 2 panelists, Glenn-Marie Lang from the World Bank, who has also been involved for a long time in making sure that we have good systems to measure these things, as well as Joe Grice from UK Office of National Statistics. And the UK has also good experience since many years back on how to measure natural capital and also to bring it to policymakers. So I think we will have a really interesting session. And with that, I would like to ask Paul Ekins to make the first scene setting presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Viveka, for that kind introduction. And I will start without any further ado just by sharing my screen so that people can see the presentation. And that should be okay. So, yes, I'm at University College London, but for today's purposes, I'm speaking really as a co-chair of the Natural Capital Working Group of the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. And Joe Grice is the other co-chair, so it's well represented here. And we thank very much the OECD for inviting us to present some of our work, which, as you would expect, is focused on natural capital and how to measure it. It's commissioned a certain amount of work, and I'm going to run very quickly through some of that work before ending with some conclusions. all the sessions that I've attended so far from this fascinating OECD conference, and that's all of them, have emphasized the importance of information and reporting and measuring. And the old slogan is that you can't manage what you don't measure. And although it's an old slogan, it's nevertheless a true one. And in this session, we're going to be talking about two of these slices of the information pyramid. I think Carl is going to be talking about the SEEA, which is all about the accounts, and deriving from the accounts, obviously, is a very wide range of possible indicator systems. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is the natural capital indicator framework, which we've developed as part of this work with the GGKP. So this diagram comes not from that work directly, but from a journal paper which is in press that derives from that work. And we were very surprised when we came to undertake it, despite the fact that natural capital has been a concept that's been around for a very long time. There wasn't a natural capital indicator framework that had sound conceptual basis and that seemed to really capture what the topic was all about. And so this was our response, this natural capital indicator framework, starting here with the stocks of capital, with the various metrics that you can use for that, the extent of natural capital, the condition of natural capital, or the value of natural capital. As everyone knows, that then produces biophysical flows, and these are biophysical indicators of goods and ecosystem services that come from the natural capital. And then that produces outputs for humans, benefits that can be valued both in money terms, but also that have social impacts, and also residuals. And then there are various feedback mechanisms, as one expects to find in a complex system. Importantly, this process of producing goods and services from natural capital usually involves also human inputs, and it's really important that those human inputs are taken into account, because the productivity of natural capital depends critically on those human inputs. So that's the conceptual framework, and you can read more about it in this journal article that's in press. We're currently bidding into several research programs actually to get some applications for it, because obviously for as long as it only remains in the form of an academic paper, it's not particularly useful to anyone. So I'll move on to the second piece of work that was produced in this program. And this was something by Anil Markandia. And the research question there was to say, well, countries have signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. What is the natural capital gap between where we currently are in terms of the stock of natural capital and the stock that we would need in order to reach these Sustainable Development Goals? And you can see that Anil has gone through a number of Sustainable Development Goals. He's considered the various forms of natural capital that you would need in order to reach these goals, and the measures that you would need to take in order to, or the issues that you would need to address in order to increase the stock of natural capital such that it was able to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. And then he's provided a valuation of that gap. And if we look at this, this is the amount of natural capital that you would need to generate in order to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. You can see you've got a lower bound and an upper bound, and with some of them, there's quite a lot of uncertainty between these numbers. We can see there, compared with World Bank estimates of natural capital, that this is a very significant increase in the stock of natural capital that currently exists. And you can see the various forms of natural capital that would need to be invested in. And Anil is producing a follow-up paper to that one that is actually looking at the expenditures that you would require, because this is the value of the natural capital that's being generated. Anil is looking at the expenditures that would need to be made actually in order to restore that natural capital. So we can look forward to the publication of that paper in due course. This is his estimate of both the way in which the overall gap is broken down into these different forms of natural capital, and that's the lower bound, and this is the upper bound, and you can see that actually the lower and upper bounds do make quite a lot of difference to the pie chart as to how these various forms of natural capital are distributed. Then I'd like to move on to a third publication that we made, and this is an issue very close to my heart, and I suspect to the heart of everyone listening, and certainly to the heart of the OECD, which is how is natural capital analysis actually used in policy? And we did a literature search, so a pretty comprehensive literature search looking at the descriptions of how natural capital had been used in policy. And you can see the first one there is dated 1989. So this is a concept that has been with us for just over 30 years. Rather few papers published to start with, and then suddenly in the kind of the middle of the last decade, a huge explosion of all sorts of publications from about 2014, with the grey literature being the filled bars and the academic literature being the white bars. I feel a bit ashamed to say that it looks as if the academic literature is having to catch up with the grey literature, because obviously bodies like the World Bank and many other bodies that would not be classed as academic publications have actually been publishing in this area for a very long time, as Glenn Marie will know, because she's been responsible for a lot of those publications herself. We then looked and said, well, okay, these are all the publications which say that natural capital has been used. How effectively has it been used? What's it been used for? What kinds of government policies has it been used to inform? And we classified these papers in various ways. So according to the type of government decision, we used an OECD breakdown of the kinds of government decisions that you can think about government policy in, the type of natural capital metrics and data, the type of natural stocks, flows, and associated human activities. And as part of this work, we organized a workshop at Stanford University, where they have the Natural Capital Project, of course, and we also used some of the criteria that emerged in that project as being important. Something which we found absolutely extraordinary from this work was that only 2 papers actually reported on the policy impact of the use of natural capital information in decision making. So lots of the papers were talking about the sorts of things that the authors hoped would happen with the application of natural capital information in respect to policy, but actually only 2 papers gave any kind of evaluation as to what had actually been done. And so our conclusions from this paper were that, well, the impact of natural capital information on government decision-making is currently profoundly underreported, with only those 2 papers. So there's an acute knowledge gap in relation to the specific impacts of natural capital indicators on decision-making. Does all this information that SEEA is producing and that we would like to produce under this natural capital indicator framework, does it actually make a difference to decision-making? And I think we need much more information on that. And the public evidence base is dominated by reports of opportunities for impact. We all hope it's going to be impactful, but much less evidence of the realized impact reported. And I just wanted to finish this brief presentation by looking in a bit more detail at these 2 publications which we found, which did analyze the actual impact of using natural capital in policy interventions, using the natural capital approach. And these are 2 papers, one looking at the payments for ecosystem services in Costa Rica, obviously a very well-known case of intervention using the ideas around natural capital, and also integrated planning in relation to coastal Belize. And these bullet points, it's quite a busy slide because the devil in these matters is nearly always in the detail. And I think they cast quite a lot of insight into why these evaluations are so rare, and it's because they're actually so difficult. The institutional governance and cultural contexts are terribly important. It's difficult to assess the impacts of natural capital projects on particular ecosystem services. These interventions are complex, time-consuming and expensive, and they involve intensive stakeholder participation. And that was true in both the studies that were reported here. Obviously, it's easier to implement these kinds of interventions where you get demonstrably increased financial returns. But of course, ecosystem services are often non-market ecosystem services, and the money values associated with those are very uncertain. It's difficult to associate them with specific beneficiaries, and therefore they don't perceive them to be in their strongly in their self-interest, whereas the opportunity costs of environmental protection may fall on powerful interests who will oppose them. And finally, the financial resources needed for the investment in natural capital are real money, and they come from scarce public resources. The two countries, obviously, we're talking about are not high-income countries, and the complexities of actually justifying those investments can make these difficult to justify. So I think I'll stop there, Viveka. I have one more slide, which was looking at the questions that you've asked at the beginning of the session, but I can introduce those later during the discussion if they seem relevant. So back to you, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Paul. This was very thought-provoking, and I've got a lot of questions, but I'll save them for later. And instead, I will invite Carl Obst from IDEA, and also our main author for the SEEA standards that the statistical community are working on. So please, Carl, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Viveka, and thank you, Paul, for that introduction. I'm going to quickly share my screen here. And sorry. Just when you want things to work, it doesn't quite, hang on. So a quick overview and scene setting on the component of the SEEA aspect of things. And obviously with something like this, you'd like to think about all of the different things you could talk about. So unfortunately, I've probably only got about 7 or 8 minutes, but I'll try and pick some highlights and hopefully dovetail in with the messages that Paul's been giving as well. Interestingly, I'm going to start with an information pyramid as well. It's quite an intriguing beast, this information pyramid. It's been around for quite some time now. And from an accounting point of view, you can tell quite a lot of stories about it. So I'm going to take it from a slightly different perspective. And one is about the role of accounts and why they might be important. And I think it speaks a little bit to the challenges which Paul just raised at the end. The argument that I'd like to sort of place for accounts and the challenge around biodiversity measurement and environmental information more generally is that my experience, I've come from a background in economic statistics, and so I've come into the environmental space sort of more recently in the last 10 years. And it seems quite clear that what we've got is a range of policy issues which are dealt with by different agencies, or the same agency but different policies. So we have issues around climate change, biodiversity, there might be things around pest and invasive species in agriculture, and they're all managed in slightly different silos. And what happens in that case is that we get some information sets that are developed for each of those policies that might be quite suitable for each of those policies, but you don't get this way of sort of bringing that information together. And from an economic point of view, we tend to not have that challenge in a way. We've got different information sets for agriculture, for investment, for manufacturing, but we have this process of national accounting where we actually have an underpinning data set which tells you about the relationships between all of these different industries and different expenditures. So one of the goals of the SEEA is to somehow say, well, can we integrate these information sets so that when you're looking at the individual policies, you're actually basing them off a common and coherent set of information. So that's the objective, is to move from these policy and information silos to something that's a more integrated perspective. And indeed, as a general observation, I'd say that one of the challenges we face is how do we move to a more integrated view of environmental policy, which is not broken up into biodiversity, climate change, waste, but rather thinks about things in a more integrated perspective. And natural capital is a lens by which that might be possible. So more particularly, the rest of these slides are a bit more focused on the SEEA specifically, and then I finish on the question of what are some of the challenges of raising up the amount of implementation of the SEEA and the potential of these data sets. So the SEEA framework has got 4 main components. In actual fact, there's quite strong resonance with the type of natural capital information indicator framework that Paul indicated before. So there's measures of environmental flows of water and energy and waste, air emissions. There's information on natural resources, looking at timber and fish and minerals in sort of a classic natural resource accounting perspective. There are information on environmental transactions, environmental taxes and subsidies, expenditure on the environment. The environmental transactions are currently recorded in the standard national accounts, but the SEEA helps to tease those out and gives them a particular focus. And then the final part of the picture is on ecosystem assets and their services that they provide. And that's a more recent part of the SEEA picture. And sort of collectively, these try to tell a fairly complete story about the relationship between the economy and the environment. And I think that relationship story is a particularly important one. Another way of sort of viewing these things is to think about and sort of partly because this is an OECD presentation, that the link between pressure, state, impact and response occurred to me as sort of making these connections of how you can frame up the relevance of each of these different parts of the SEEA framework. So the environmental flows part will speak a lot to the issues of pressures, as will sort of over-harvesting on the natural resources side. In terms of the state, what's the environment looking like? How's it changing? What's its quality? Issues around understanding the stock of natural resources and how that's changing will give you some information. But I think that the addition of the focus on ecosystem asset extent and condition that we're doing in the ecosystem accounting space gives a particularly rich story around the state of the environment, and then moves into the question of impact, because it starts to bring up questions about the benefits that might be gained or lost from changes in that state. And then the environmental transaction component tells you something about the responses that are being made by governments and societies. The question, this is sort of another sort of variation on the top end of the information pyramid, the idea being that we can bring, the way in which the SEEA framework works is that it's a set of definitions and concepts and classifications that work together. So it's not that we've just got 4 pieces of information, but the relationships between all of these pieces of information it's designed in a way that the information can link together. So with that sort of filtering device, as it were, on a whole set of data that's that's currently available, we bring that together so that a whole range of different decision makers can look at this different problems or the same problem, but through the same, using the same information set. And that can then be used in a whole range of different applications. So we're trying to skip that step of each user finding their own data set to suit their own policy purpose or policy need. And that's one of the challenges that I've seen in looking at sustainability indicators for the last 20 years, that we have this sort of, the result has been that we end up with a lot of different sustainability indicator sets, all based on new and emerging data sets, but not the piece in the middle that brings it together to give us a common language and a common framing for what's actually happening. The broader SEEA framework, SEEA is becoming quite a thing. There's quite a lot of documents that are linked. Sort of the genesis of much of the work on the SEEA has come from the System of National Accounts, which is the document shown up there, the latest standard being from 2008. And so a lot of the initial focus on the SEEA was looking at how can we adjust measures of GDP. There's a general understanding that GDP wasn't telling a complete story about progress and human development. So what adjustments could be made could be, in particular, recognise the cost of using up the environment. Things have progressed, and so it's a much broader document now and broader system in SEEA. The central framework deals with 3 of the aspects that we talked about in that just before, and currently we have a process to develop further the ecosystem accounting component, which was originally released in 2013, but has been going under a revision process for the last couple of years. We're getting in the final stages of that process at the moment, and we're looking to be submitting a document to the United Nations Statistical Commission in March of next year. But within that sort of those broader conceptual framings of the central framework and ecosystem accounting, there's a range of specific thematic areas we're focusing on as well. Going back about 10 years or so, there's a focus on water accounting for water flows and stocks. There's a focus on an effort on energy. There's been work on agriculture, forestry and fisheries. And there's more work that's emerging at the moment on linking things together around oceans, on tourism and on biodiversity specifically. What's been quite fantastic over the course of the last 10 years that the number of countries who are looking at implementing the SEEA is now around 100. Not necessarily saying they're implementing every aspect of the possible set of accounts, but certainly with programs of work that are underway. And increasingly, we're making very strong connections institutionally. So a particular one I can highlight in the context of biodiversity is the work with the Convention on Biological Diversity, where the SEEA and the set of indicators, which is currently being renegotiated for the 2020 targets for the CBD, are being linked together. So, and further that the national statistical officers are going to be given a very specific role in reporting on progress towards the CBD objectives. So I think this is, it's sort of it's a building institutionalisation of the measurement of the environment in a way that perhaps hasn't existed before. So then to talk about some barriers and what steps might seem. So these are things that I see as perhaps reasons why accounting hasn't maybe had the impact, or natural capital accounting hasn't had the impact that it might, but what might also be done in order to tackle things. One of the things is we need to move from one-off and ad hoc assessments to more regular and ongoing compilation of accounts. There needs to be an expectation that we're reporting on the environment on a regular basis. And by and large, consistent time series of environmental information is not a strong point, certainly relative to the breadth of information on the economy. The second point is that putting together accounts and doing this step of integration and trying to see how you can come up with aligned definitions and classifications is generally regarded as a cost, as much as protecting the environment is often seen as a cost. The natural capital philosophy, but also the accounting philosophy, is that you want to invest in the information, that it is an investment to spend the time, to put in the effort, to integrate the data and to come up with what I would call a shared environmental history. We have that on the economic side. Even though you might quibble about the measure of GDP, we've got a fair understanding that GDP in every country in the world this year has collapsed and might be coming back in some way, we hope. So, but the question of how the environment and its history is often a matter of debate. And somehow we need to look at that investment so we've got this agreed story of what has happened. And then we can focus on the policy responses and whether some policies are working, whether they're not, rather than finding information to justify a particular solution. Another one which I find particularly interesting and has come from my engagement increasingly with the private sector and how they're thinking about natural capital, because it's certainly a very healthy discussion that's been essentially in parallel to the discussions in the public sector, is to move beyond a focus on disclosure and reporting to focus on how do you integrate accounting thinking into your local management decisions. I think there is sometimes a belief that if we report on things, people will change their behaviour. And to some extent that works, but largely my view is that we might convince 15 to 20% of the people to change their behaviour based on logic and evidence. But by and large, it will require something much stronger in order to get some scale happening and get the pace of change we need. So it's not sufficient just to have good reported data. We've got to bring it into the mindsets and the thinking of people making choices at local levels. That's certainly possible, and accounting can undertake that role, but it needs to be a focus. And finally, I think there's a large perception that accounting requires valuation or monetary valuation. There's certainly contexts in which monetary valuation is going to be important and useful, but it is certainly not the only, even any monetary valuation and assessment needs to be complemented by understanding the stocks, the thresholds, the limits, the physical boundaries. How we bring those together is an important part of decision making, but I think there's also a need for us to continue the story to say that accounting, and particularly that which is highlighted in the SEEA, accounting can be done in physical terms and using non-financial data, and not only in monetary terms. And I think if we can start recognising that accounting has a role to play in the organisation of all types of information, will be a big step forward. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk, for the invitation of the OECD, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Carl. So we now have a little time to reflect on these keynote presentations, and I would also like the two of you to reflect a bit around the three policy questions, or the ones that you would want to use. So if I can start with Paul, you had a very thought-provoking intervention, and it makes me wonder, when do we know that data are effective in policy making? And when they are, who is going to write the paper on it? Could we think of ways when that would actually happen? I'm thinking that in those rare occasions when I could really point to environmental accounts data being of use in policy, I don't know how I would phrase it. It's very often that it moves the debate. Suddenly you have your prime minister talking about issues that he did not talk about before, or suddenly you have stakeholders who recognize that there is a regular data source that they can use in their advocating, but it's very hard to figure out how to actually make that into a scientific paper. But I think we should keep that in mind. But otherwise, I would really want to ask you, like, how can we ensure that these data are used for evidence policy making? Do you have any advice for us on how to make that happen? And do you have any ideas on how to get over the bumps or the main challenges? I can't hear you. I'll put myself out, and if you can put your microphone on.
No, that's fine. I started talking before I'd unmuted, which is a common mistake these days. Yeah, I mean, that of course is the million-dollar question in a way, and it is a million-dollar question because these data systems can be expensive. As Carl said, I think those expenses need to be regarded as investments because information is absolutely critical in the world we're living in order to get a handle on these environmental issues, as with so much else. And we can see just how important it's been in terms of carbon accounting and carbon measurement. I mean, imagine trying to get a handle on the climate crisis if we had not worked out how to measure greenhouse gases and how they might be reduced and the impact that they had on global climate. So I think that's a very good example where a relatively simple measure and the fact that you can convert greenhouse gases to carbon equivalents means that it's been absolutely critical in the whole framing of the debate and in the policy measures and targets that have been taken. Other environmental systems are unfortunately much more difficult, and we can't collect information across all issues at the same time. So my answer to your question really is, firstly, make sure that the data is collected for indicators that have resonance in the policy process. Find out what it is that the policymakers are particularly interested in and therefore want to know about. And that requires working with the policymakers to understand those questions and orienting the data and indicators towards these. And that seems pretty obvious. And I think the last thing I would say about that really speaks to the strength of thinking of these issues in terms of natural capital. I mean, some of us may regret that most policymakers regard the economy as much more important than the environment per se. And I've been struggling against that, obviously, for most of my academic life, because I don't believe it reflects the reality of the situation. But if we can reflect these environmental issues in terms of their contribution to the economy, and that's precisely the purpose of thinking of it in terms of natural capital, then I think we are more likely to catch their attention. And you will know that the UK has had a natural capital committee for the last 7 or 8 years. They've made recommendations. They've certainly caused people in the Treasury who'd never given natural capital a second thought to think, oh, well, yes, here is a category of assets that we were ignoring, and we shouldn't ignore assets because assets are important to the economy. And I think we can hope that there would be some change because of that. But these kinds of changes in mindset tend to occur quite slowly. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time in order to start giving the environment the emphasis that it deserves.
Thank you very much. Did you also want to share your slides with your own thinking about this?
Well, no, what I actually did was, while I was talking, I went back to my presentation, but you didn't know that. And I had a look at what I'd said in my slide, and I more or less said it to you with a few embellishments. So there we are.
Thank you very much. And then Carl, so you are sitting in the midst of us trying to now get everything together in one document around how to be able to measure both natural capital and biodiversity. So what would you say, what are there specific perceptions that are needed to clarify, or what would you say would be the challenges that we are up against and how could we overcome them?
I suspect at the end of the day, one of the biggest challenges we face, and perhaps for many of the people on the call in trying to sort of get the environmental outcomes that we're looking for, is to recognise that at the end of the day, it's probably not a technical question. We have the technical solutions. There's no shortage of data in actual fact. It's remarkable how much data there is out there. It might all be telling slightly different stories and have different classifications, but the effort that's placed and the resources that go into data are just phenomenal. But I think it also goes to this question of, I mean, how do people make decisions? And if we think that evidence is the overwhelming sort of factor in decision making, I think we might like to think that because we're technicians and we rely on evidence and we've got degrees and all these types of things. But in actual fact, I think the reality is that social norms, the sort of pressures, different relationships with different people, those types of things will often play a much stronger role in decision making than the evidence itself. So I think we've got to take a step back and then understand that reality about the fact that people don't make decisions and change behaviours purely on logic. Everyone might have given up smoking a whole long time ago if it was based purely on the evidence. So what does that mean? What role do we then have? And I think that's where, for me, the role of standards comes in. We can argue about the definitions and the classifications and the exact scopes of measurement for forever. But how do we reach some sort of common language, which actually means that there's some sort of push through in terms of actually bringing this together and coming with a common message and a common story, a common narrative. And for me, that's why I have reflected for a long time about why the National Accounts has been so successful as an information base. And it's simply because every country has one GDP. I saw a presentation 6 or 7 years ago that had 6 different measures of forest change in Indonesia. One of them was going up. And so if you're in that situation and you're a decision maker, you think, oh, well, what would I do? And I mean, every forest measure seems justified and it's a forest after all. But then you're not going to get any action at all. So I think if we can focus on trying to reach some common agreement around them, it won't be perfect, but it will be common, then we'll have a chance to have more of an impact than we have had to date in the environmental space.
Thank you very much. So I hear that somehow we need a common language and we need to make that language sort of also include new bits of society, perhaps, so that also trade agreements and taxation and things like that are also within the same knowledge language place. So thank you very much. And with that, I would like to turn to our panelists. And if I can invite you, Joe Price, to talk a bit about the experience from the natural capital accounting in the UK and how you have been received. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Carl and Paul, for two fascinating presentations. I mean, what I take from both of them actually is that there's an enormous amount of work has gone on, a very high intellectual quality, to produce a really good supply of information about natural capital and all of its dimensions. And clearly, very exciting developments are underway. Much less evidence that these have yet been really effective in influencing policy and decision making. To some areas, yes, but a very long way to go. On the indicator side, indicators have been around for quite a long time, and I think it's fair to say they've got a pretty checkered history in terms of their impact. One of the reasons I think that is the case, Carl alluded to, but having been involved in policy making in government for most of my career, politicians are very good at choosing those indicators that show their case nicely and describing those indicators which actually don't have quite as favourable account of what they've been doing. And so one of the issues is how do you get an authoritative set of indicators which politicians are unable to pick and choose those which suit their case. On the accounting side, as Carl said, national accounting has been very successful in its own terms. When we publish GDP figures, the quarterly national accounts in the UK, quite often it dominates the news coverage for the day. It's an enormous issue right on the front pages. National capital accounts to date, probably lucky to be in page 5 at best. So there the issue is how do you get an extension of the national accounts and the power they have into other dimensions of reality, which we know to be important, not least natural assets. Now, having said that, I don't want that to sound pessimistic, because I think we're at probably a uniquely point of opportunity. So far as the indicator agenda is concerned, the SDGs, conventional biological diversity, these are things that governments care about, and they care about them because their citizens and their voters care about them. So I think we have a unique opportunity to embed a well thought through indicator system into exactly these kind of devices that governments have to take seriously and do care about. Equally, on the accounting side, the work I think that's been done, tremendously impressive work to produce integrated environmental, natural capital accounts and the national accounts is very powerful. In the UK, just 3 weeks ago, we published for the first time integrated national capital and national accounts in the same annual document, the Blue Book, and that will be the model for the future. What that does is it makes it very easy to ask questions like, look, yeah, we've grown by 2% or whatever, but have you noticed in the process we've actually lost 5% of our natural assets, or 8% or whatever it is? And that's a very easy question to ask. And it's one, again, that all the evidence suggests our citizens care about a lot. So in that sense, making that kind of extended questioning a possibility by means of extending the accounting in the way that the SEEA is allowed is potentially a really powerful way of getting these considerations much more priority and much more embedded in decision making. And I think this is all the more important as we come out of COVID. The tendency in the past, I think, would have been to say, hey, look, we've got an economic crisis. Don't worry about these environmental things. They're all sort of nice to haves, but look, let's concentrate on the essentials, i.e. the economy. That, I think, will be much more difficult if our citizens continue, as I believe they will, to say natural capital, natural assets are important. And the final thing I'd say, before I shut up, is that the importance of an informed commentariat who actually keep pushing these questions is a really important part of the menu. It may be partly international bodies like the OECD, the World Bank and others. It's also, I think, embedding this in national commentary and for national actors and, dare I say it, citizens to push and to ask these questions. And given the evidence we have about how importantly citizens do regard natural capital, natural assets, citizens and voters, then I think we've got a good basis for going forward. If we can get the demand for this kind of information going with the plentiful supply that Carl and Paul have both demonstrated, then I think we're onto a winner. And I think that's the agenda for the next 2 or 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And very exciting. I'll look forward to read your new integrated assessment. That sounds like we could all learn from that. Glenn-Marie, please, could I also ask you to take the floor?
Sure. Just by way of context, the World Bank has been, for the past 10 years, been supporting implementation of the SEEA natural capital accounting in our client countries, low and middle income countries around the world. And we're continuing now into the next decade. Many thanks for the information from Paul and Carl. Great to see the new work done by GGKP. And of course, many thanks to Carl for moving the SEEA forward. Let me just make a few comments around these policy questions. In terms of challenges in measuring natural capital, and this is more from the perspective of our low and middle income countries, there's been a tremendous explosion of data and our ability to process it, the increased use of machine learning, for example. But the capacity in our countries, the countries we work with, to process the data, to interpret it, and to apply it is still trying to catch up with a fast-moving system. And so the need for capacity building so that countries feel ownership of this themselves and not something that outsiders parachute in and do for them will be very important in building the citizen ownership, et cetera, et cetera. What Carl said about the systematic standardized data is really critical. No country wants to be, well, few countries want to be the first movers. They want to know who else is doing this. And what we see in our work is when a country asks about the natural capital, whether it's through the WAVES program or some of our global databases like our comprehensive wealth, they want to know how they're doing over time. Are things getting better or worse? So you need a time series. But they also want to know how they're doing compared to other countries that are important to them. Who are their peers? Who are they aspiring to? And how are they doing? So there's a sense that we all have to move together on this in order to build support and find a way to use this. One of the things that we're finding is increasingly important is building regional communities of practice. These are, we're starting in Africa, we'll probably move to Latin America as well. But these are platforms where countries can come together themselves and share their experiences and help each other move forward. And I think this will be a very critical step in really mainstreaming this, getting people together to talk about how do they do it, how do they use it, what have they learned from it, and so on. So, you know, support for a regional community of practice on natural capital, it will be very important. We've already seen some work in Africa, as I mentioned, on this. There's, in terms of one of the questions having to do with what more we need to do or what more information we need, this issue of critical natural capital, where are we approaching thresholds? What's the limit to economic valuation? Economic valuation is useful when you don't have so much of a resource that it doesn't matter, everyone has whatever they need, or you're not so constrained that the value becomes infinite. Where are we in that range? how close are we to thresholds? I would love to be able to complement what we do on the value that assumes we can trade off here or there in small amounts with how close are we getting to the edge of the cliff? How close are we to falling off? We all know that with climate change, we're likely to be there sometime in the future, but when, where, how? And so let me stop at that. Two things: the capacity building in our low and middle income countries, and particularly how they can learn from each other. A lot of our middle income countries have great capacity already and could really lead. And some platform for sharing experiences in the regions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This is all excellent. I see also that we have very many questions in the chat, and so I suggest we now turn to those. And if I can, let's see, I'll try and start and give them to you one by one as best as I can. We have one from Karen Xiu Ting, who recently started to work in the Northern Ireland Environmental Agency. So I'm looking at Joe Price, please. The question is around, could you point to some key studies or examples on how to use biodiversity indicators or ecological indicators that they need to measure? Do you feel ready for this, Joe? While you are thinking, I can say that for Sweden, when we have been looking at ecological indicators, we have turned to the Habitat Directive and looked at the type of reporting that the countries are doing there on species and habitats. So that has been, and then we've been speaking to people who are reporting to that and trying that way to get some information around ecological indicators that are in policy processes. Joe, do you feel?
Very sorry, I simply couldn't find the way to unmute, but I've managed to do that now, so technology being defeated. I was very struck, actually, in this context, by something that Carl said about the importance of embedding this not just into kind of macroeconomic holding to account, but also into local decision making. And certainly our experience in the UK is that some of the most valuable applications of the natural capital information have been at local level and in local management. And to give a couple of examples, the way that our national parks are managed is actually, I think, quite significantly influenced by the information available, which actually eventually goes into the macroeconomic accounts, but in this instance is more useful at a local level in a consistent way. And similarly, to a seminar that I virtually attended yesterday, we had a very nice account from the Chief Executive of the Forestry Commission England about how they had been working for 5 years, I think, on producing natural capital accounts for their activities. But he said the real challenge and the real progress they've made has now been to embed that in the way that they manage forestry in the UK. So I think those are a couple of examples that I'm aware of, but I think they're just indicative of exactly what Carl said, that there is an enormous amount of information here that can be used not just to hold governments to account, but actually to embed this in decision-making across our society and across our economies.
Thank you very much. I see another question here, which is how to deal with capital stocks that do not belong to a single jurisdiction, like sea fish schools and migrant birds, among others, from Juan David Sainz-Piano. I'm sorry about the pronunciation. I don't really know who to stretch out my hand, so I'll say something, and then if any one of you feel that you would like to answer this, you can put up your hand. But I can say that for Sweden, we have looked at the consumption of fish and couple that to information around where this fish is being taken up and what type of fishery it is. So we've been able to say, of all the fish that is being consumed in Sweden, what parts belong to species that either have a detrimental, where the fishery itself has a detrimental effect, or if it's fish schools that are on the verge of disappearing. And then, of course, also fish that seem more having a stable situation, or that is picked up with methods that do not destroy the habitat around. Not sure how to treat it in capital. Thank you very much, Carl.
Maybe just a couple of quick observations. I think it's the first point would be that the theory about how you would account for it is exactly the same, whether or not it's attributable to a country or not attributable to a country. And there's been some excellent studies that have been done, I think particularly the World Bank on worldwide fish stocks in terms of looking at natural resources in that context. So I think the issue here is more about when you have resources which are part of a global commons, you have a tendency not to report on them in the same way because no one is sort of obviously responsible for them. One of the topics that we have been discussing in the sort of on the fringes of the SEEA development has the development of global accounts for the commons, for potentially for the atmosphere, for the oceans more generally. There is a large body of work that's developing on ocean accounts. So I think it's sort of in that space that theoretically it's fine to do, but it's about finding the right home for someone to undertake the work. I'd also suggest that there's there's still going to be a situation where for a lot of ocean type issues, many of the sort of aspects we want to think about are still going to be within national jurisdiction. So a lot of the harvesting of fish will still be within the exclusive economic zone, for example. So they still should be within the capture of the remit of a standard set of accounts. So.
Thank you very much. And here is the question specifically for you, Glenn-Marie. It's got your name on it. Regarding the how close are we to the cliff? Do you have any suggestions on how to address the cases where we know we are already over the cliff, such as overfishing, where countries still approve quotas and still subsidize fisheries?
Yeah, that's a very tough one because, I mean, the economic case has been made over and over and over again. It's a question of political will. And we even work a lot with colleagues at the University of British Columbia's Ocean Center, and they have done a lot of work to see what would be the benefits of restoring fisheries to sustainable management. But this is totally in the realm, which I believe several of our colleagues have mentioned already, of political will. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that, except to keep advocating. We keep advocating, and hopefully before they're all gone, it will make a difference.
So thank you very much, all of you. We have 2 minutes, so I don't think we are able to take any more questions right now. I feel that we've really been able to show where we are in measurement and what type of challenges that are still before us. And so let's all continue to help each other to find this common language, and also to realize that in some cases we don't have one actor who is going to reap the benefits or not, but it's a policy issue with very many different policy actors, some of whom may have benefits and others not. Some of them are not even born yet. So thank you all. It's been lovely to be your moderator, and I hope I will see you again.
And thank you very much, Vibeke, for your excellent moderating for this very interactive session. And thank you again for all the panelists.
And thank you for all the question makers. So
yes, and thank you for your active engagement of everybody who's participating online through the Q&A sessions. We hope next year we go back to the in-person conference. Let's see, we hope.